Hey, hello guys, and welcome back to the Cold War stories. And today in our seventh lecture of the Cold War, I am going to talk about the Second Indochina War, or in the West, in the capitalist West, it would be known as the Vietnam War, which lasted from 1955 all the way to 1975. So that basically meant the war lasted for almost 2 decades. And so the war was fought between North Vietnam and South Vietnam, which were supported by North was supported by the communist countries like the Soviet Union, China, and North Korea, and the South was supported by the United States and the other capitalist countries that were against the Soviets and the communist forces, communist allies. And so we need to go back into the 1988, the 1880s. So because the Vietnam was an Indochina colony of France. It was a French colony at the time. It was under French rule. And so later on, it was towards the end of World War II. That was when World War II ended. That was when we dropped the 2 nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki during that time. And so going forward, a new government was established in Vietnam that was known as the Democratic People's Republic of Vietnam, which was established in 1945. So that meant shortly after the war of World War II ended. And so a communist dictatorship was established in the North Vietnam, kind of like the same thing in North Korea shortly after the end of World War II. That was a communist dictatorship was established there. And so later on, it was in it was between the World War II that was going on. The Vietnam forces, the Viet Minh, which was a communist force, Vietnamese communist force that fought against the Japanese occupiers who fought in World War II against the Vietnamese, because the Vietnamese people were fighting against the Japanese. They were against the Japanese. They were on the United States side. They were allies with the United States. And they were going to fight against each other in the war. And so and then after that, it was in 1955. That was when North Vietnam invaded South Vietnam, and then that started a war between those two countries, and that started the Second Indochina War, or that was known as in the West as the Vietnam War, or the War in Vietnam, which was the deadliest war in Vietnam at the time after World War II, from what I remember. And so that was kind of like a devastating war because a lot of American troops were killed in Vietnam because they were fighting against communist forces, against the Viet Cong, which was communist force in the North Vietnam, and they were fighting against the South Vietnam. They were fighting against the South Vietnamese troops there, or soldiers. And so during that time, it was during the presidency of JFK, he started to send ground troops or soldiers into North Vietnam to fight against the communist forces of Vietnam, which was being supported by the Soviet Union. And then if you remember, under the leadership of Brezhnev, he started to give the North Vietnamese people guns, tanks, and providing them all this military. The Soviets were providing the North Vietnamese military because North Vietnam were allies with the Soviet Union because they were both communism. Kind of like similar thing with North Korea and Soviet Union during the Korean War that was fought between North and South Korea, those two countries, which are still divided today. And so after JFK was assassinated in 1963, Lyndon B. Johnson started to send more American soldiers to fight in Vietnam. And some American people were against it because they felt like it was a big embarrassment because a lot of American troops started to die in Vietnam. There was over thousands of American troops dying. And then they were protesting against it. And even college students were protesting. And they held this signs on the street: "Let peace with Vietnam, peace of Vietnam, take our troops out of Vietnam." And the original service for men in the military at the time, in the U.S. military, was at the age of 18. That was the age you get to serve in the military. to fight in the war. And so women could not fight in the war because they were in the hospitals, like treating the veterans who were injured or who got badly injured. The women were in the hospital taking care of the injured soldiers who got killed. I mean, who got injured at the time. Sorry. And so by the 1968, that was when the 10 defense the terror defenses the terror offense, that was when this American troops, I think they started bombing North Vietnam, and that was kind of like a big failure for the United States because the North Vietnamese won that battle. And so that was kind of like a big victory. That was like a victory for the North Vietnamese people. And so the Battle of Hue City, that was a city in Vietnam. That was won by, I think it was by American troops, from what I recall correctly. I think they managed to take over the city in Vietnam, but they defeated the North Vietnamese forces who were fighting in the North Vietnam. And so continuing on in 1970s, I think that was when Nixon was president of the United States. And so Nixon started to take out troops from North Vietnam because a lot of troops were dying in the Vietnam. And they were dying in the war because they were being killed by the Vietnamese communists. And so they started withdrawing troops out of there. And so I think it was between 1965, that was when newly elected Soviet Prime Minister or Premier Alexei Kosygin visited North Vietnam so they could improve their relationships, because they wanted to have strong relationships with the North Vietnam because they were both communists. They were both communist nations. And they wanted to improve on their relationship between those two communist countries. And so it was and then we actually started bombing Vietnam, not like atomic bombs. We just started bombing a bunch of cities in Vietnam with just regular bombs or regular missiles from airplanes. We would just be dropping missiles out of airplanes, and it would destroy a lot of cities in the North Vietnam, and a lot of people started dying. And then also civil rights activists, Martin Luther King gave a speech about Vietnam would take out the troops out of Vietnam, because that was like, they said the war in Vietnam was not necessary. It was totally devastating because a lot of American troops were dying. And so they were saying going into Vietnam was a mistake. Kind of like the war in Iraq at that time. The war in Iraq was probably a big mistake. That's kind of like similar thing to the Vietnam War. And so that war would continue all the way until 1975. That was when the fall of Saigon took place. That was the capital of North Vietnam. It was a city in South Vietnam, and the communists managed to take over that city, and that led to the end of the Vietnam War. And so after that, the war in Vietnam was over. So for about 20 years, the Vietnamese people were killed, they were injured, and they died from the war for those 20 years. So that was kind of like the devastating war in Vietnam at the time. And that was the war. That was the second Indochina War. I don't know about the first Indochina War, so maybe I'm gonna have to do a little more research about it. So I know Soviet Union had a major role in it, because they were helping the North Vietnamese give guns and weapons in the 60s under Brezhnev, when Brezhnev was General Secretary of Communist Party of Soviet Union. And Kazakh visited the North Vietnam, like I said previously in the lecture, in this lecture. And so that was kind of like the devastating war that we've been through at the time after World War II, because a lot of people in Vietnam were dying because a lot of people were being killed in the Vietnam. So hopefully you guys enjoy this lecture, and in our next lecture I am going to talk about the removal of Nikita Khrushchev and the beginning of the Brezhnev era, which I will talk about in the 8th lecture of the Cold War stories. And I'll see you guys in my next lecture. Thank you very much for listening to this lecture.